I feel like I haven't done a traditional versus like this for quite some time, so I figure for this stretch over the next couple of months or so, we'd get back into that relatively regularly, and I figured we would start with this one, which I was already planning on before it even lined up in my head that this would be right after Shang-Chi came out, which of course the director of that, Destin Daniel Cretton, started in these much smaller movies on like the indie scene, most notably Short Term 12. And then I kind of just randomly remembered Lost Angels relatively recently, and I remember the first time I saw Lost Angels was after I had seen Short Term 12, and I remember like just kind of having this vibe during Lost Angels was like, this really reminds me of something, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And then at some point before the movie was over, I realized I was thinking of Short Term 12. And you'll notice the way in which I have seen Lost Angels. I don't know, like, it's not surprising to me at all that the way I happened to find this movie was as you see now. I'm not even sure if it has a DVD release or not. It feels so off the radar just in general. But yeah, not only is this a VHS, but it is in this rental-like case from a video store in Illinois, apparently, that, that I just happened to come across. So, yeah, so I figured at some point, after that realization, that this would probably happen at some point, because I don't believe I talked about Short Term 12 when it was, like, brand new in like a regular review. So we'll just do this and see how this goes. So obviously the thing that they have in common are we're looking at like young teenagers, and they're in one instance maybe really lost, or as the title tells us, and kind of found their way either by making terrible choices, or maybe found themselves in like the wrong circumstances at the wrong time. All these different things. As the movie starts, our lead character Tim, who is played by Adam Horovitz, who yes is Ad Rock from the Beastie Boys, giving a really good performance here. I'm kind of surprised he didn't have more of a kind of an almost like indie scene acting career after this, but because he obviously had something. But he was doing other things, of course. So maybe that's what held him back from this. But he is being put in this, what they're calling a juvenile psychiatric facility, pretty much against his will. Like, they're not even telling him necessarily where he is or what he's doing here. It's just like, oh, we're just visiting this place, and then his mom and stepfather just leave him there with no notice whatsoever after he has gotten into some trouble, whether it be through his brother or this girl that he has a thing for, Cheryl. It's always kind of the circumstances lining up, and then when we get in there and we see some of the people that are in there, it's clear that a lot of them may come from the same area, where it's like maybe they just got mixed up in the wrong circumstances, or some of them are genuinely mentally ill, and probably not getting quite the kind of attention they should be, or just, generally bad people who were those people that were making just bad decisions with hardly much remorse. It's a whole array of people, whereas obviously in Short Term 12 we're looking at a center for like foster care for at-risk teenagers who are dealing with like depression and abuse and self-harm, all those things. And throw in mental illness also, even though in this case they know to address it as what it is. Um, and obviously these places, first the movies themselves and the stories they're telling, obviously of course, are set roughly a decade and a half apart. So clearly things were being addressed in the decade of Short Term 12 probably more in detail and specifically, and really looking for treatment than the stuff that's going on in Lost Angels, especially when Lost Angels goes into that plot line about how much this place is basically run strictly for the money, and how it doesn't really matter. Like, Donald Sutherland has the big speech where he talks about when they were, getting the money for like a year, then it would take a year to treat the kids, and then when it's only 3 months, then suddenly they can cure a kid in 3 months and just send them out there because. And obviously there's much more sensitivity, especially when you look at the characters played by Brie Larson and John Gallagher Jr. Especially since, unlike the, carriers, if you want to call them that, in Lost Angels, obviously, but especially with the Brie Larson character in Short Term 12, we're getting much more of a personal reason why she does this and why she would work in a place like this with these people and how she seems to understand them so well. And the way both of them are kind of gradually, like, it kind of gradually reveals what their background is, because we know eventually that they're a couple and they live together. But then when it comes to her troubles and what she can recognize, usually from a great distance, that comes much more into play. And I think that's the thing also that's interesting about putting these two together, is how Los Angeles is a movie that kind of sets us where we get the point of view of the teen characters. Like right away, the very first scene when they're driving him to the facility, he's narrating and he's talking about how, like, how the adults are assholes, and that's a whole, like, being an asshole is a whole adult lifestyle. And he's talking about how, his, especially after having married his stepdad, that his mom and stepdad are right in that category of they're assholes, and it's like they may not even know they're assholes, but they are, and that's the whole thing. And it gives you that whole vibe of, like, at first, if you're just looking at this character and know where he's going and hearing him talk for the very first time, your immediate thought would be he's another rebellious teenager. Like, he's just another teenager having another fuck the world phase, which is every teenager's life at some point, regardless of where they come from or what they have already, or what their circumstances are. But then as we see things unravel quickly, and we see things from his point of view, and we meet his actual dad, we realize that it may be more complicated than that, and he may have more of a grounds for feeling that way than it might seem at first. So we're getting it from the perspective of the teens, and then we kind of start to open up doors and get glimpses of the adults, and then see where they're coming from and what that is. And I feel like Short Term 12 is kind of takes the opposite approach, where we're getting it from the perspective of the adults, and then the doors start to open and we start to see where the kids are coming from. So I feel like they almost kind of fit together, almost like puzzle pieces or something, when you see their approaches. But I figure we should go into more detail. I guess more like one at a time would be easier. So I think we'll go into Short Term 12 first. It's probably the much more known and recognized of them. Because it was one of those things where it was one of those movies you kind of heard about at the time it was coming out. I want to say 2013, or somewhere in 2012 or 2013, and it's from a short film that Grutton made before this with Lakeith Stanfield was in that one as well. I think he's the only cast member that carries over, if I remember correctly. But yeah, so when we meet them and we see this story being told by John Gallagher Jr. to Rami Malek, who is first starting out, it kind of sets the scene of verbally it sets the scene of the kind of shit that could happen here and the kind of stuff you need to be prepared for. And there's a while there where we're kind of looking at it through Rami Malek's perspective, and it's like, how much of this is embellished, and it's like, is it just kind of like almost like a mild hazing thing, or is this like a true story, or what? And we eventually get the gut punch ending to that story, but then right in the middle of this story, it's interrupted, and we realize that we're basically interrupted with somewhat similar of a scenario he was describing, so we're immediately pulled into it, and like I said, we're basically enter the movie through Rami Malek's perspective, despite him being a supporting character throughout the rest of it. But it immediately sets the scene through that perspective of what you might expect and how to handle that as you go. And obviously because of this, because of the way this is shown, you immediately also get the vibe that we're going to have, because the thing about it, and when you see the way that they care for the kids, especially after something dramatic has happened, is, and if you have been around these kind of kids before that have similar problems, or maybe even have worked in a place like this, you will see how that how you can really shift the tones of what's happening. And so typically after something really big or dramatic happens and everything has to try to calm down, somebody might, say something funny or do something funny or to do something to kind of calm everything down. So the movie has comedy beats that come extremely naturally when they get there. There's the moment where Caitlin Deaver has a really big meltdown and ends up shoving a cupcake that John Gallagher Jr. has made into Brie Larson's face. And then as this is all coming down, the way he just looks at her and said, like he's gonna say something serious, but then he says, "How's my cupcake?" And so you can always kind of expect that punctuation, and that's not only is it a comedy beat for the movie and for the audience after having seen something dramatic, but there's just something so real about it when that happens, and also kind of gives you like their experiences, how Brie Larson's character, especially before we even really know just how close of a place she's coming from. She just seems so incredibly in control of everything. Like she deals with something really big and dramatic at work, pretty much with the same level of cool that she would in any aspect of her life, because it just comes so naturally by that point. Like I said, that's before we even really know what we know about her. And then what's really great about this is once we get into the different kids and what is going on with them, and this now this movie is known for, like, at the time these were a lot of actors that were kind of just starting out, or it was maybe their first or second movie or something, and Brie Larson had some stuff here and there, like some supporting roles here and there, but nobody really like knew her name really, as far as I know, at least most people. And then now it's like Brie Larson's in this, Rami Malek's in this, Caitlin Deaver's in this, Lakeith Stanfield's in this, and you're like, that's an insanely stacked cast. John Goddard Jr. as well has been popping up quite a bit also, in very versatile roles. But I want to start with Lakeith Stanfield because while he definitely has a different range of emotions here, like he's somebody where you definitely get a sense, a very like heartbreaking sense about him when we see that like he's got this seemingly sort of tough exterior, like he's kind of, you know, almost hard to pinpoint because he's just kind of so stone faced about everything. But we know also that a lot of his sort of hard exterior comes from him turning 18 and pretty much desperately not wanting to leave. And then the whole scene where she cuts his hair and he breaks down, and we find out the reason he wants his hair cut so badly, and how all these things are just very just played out very understated. Like like in any other movie, they'd be a really big dramatic thing that might be even more drawn out. But it literally just feels like you took a camera into one of these places and just set it there and let it just observe, and that's what it feels like. And how we see all these different emotions that Lucky Stanfield has, where like he talks about like when he's interacting and he's like opening up a little bit, and it's like he's calming a little bit about the whole he'll eventually have to leave thing, and he starts partaking a little more, but then he usually ends up coming back to something horribly dramatic happening. Um, so there's a ton of stuff that he's doing here. But with that said, he has one scene early on. The scene where Mason, the John Goddard Jr. character, comes into the room and he says that he wrote another rap, which is apparently what he does. And this rap was apparently the rap was scripted, and then Stanfield rewrote it to make it more personal. And then in one shot, we see him perform this rap with Mason giving him the beat. And the thing about it is, you would of all the other stuff he does in the movie, when you look at an actor that gets that one movie and then breaks out, you typically say it's like, oh, they had that one movie is what their jumping off point, and they, because they got that one role, they got to where they are. I would go so far as to say it wasn't even necessarily that Keith Stanfield got this movie and that's why he's as big as he is now and an Oscar nominee now. I would go so far as to say that it was this moment, like, by itself single-handedly. Like if he didn't do anything else in the movie, if the rest of the movie was just him sitting in the background, but he had this one scene, he would probably still be where he is now. If I had to guess, that's how powerful this moment is, and it's like how some actors need a whole movie, and then they can take off, and some actors just need one moment, and I feel like this moment was all he needed to get to where he is now. But like I said, he's doing so much else in the movie, but that one moment in particular, I think, just immediately sold him. And I remember like everybody was saying his name after they saw this movie, and the same for Caitlin Dever also. Back when we didn't know those names really much anyway. Caitlin Dever had done some stuff, like her Justified run may have come by this point. But as far as being like kind of really front and center and like being like, you need to remember my name because I'm gonna do all this other great stuff, and of course she has as well, because Jaden can be probably one of the more, because sometimes there's characters that come along. If you're seeing the movie for the first time, I remember finding Jaden a bit grating before I was really able to appreciate how Deaver's performance was pulling that off, and making the character very very real. While she gets the really big moments, like her big moments are much more showy than say like Stanfield's are. But there's so much else that's so understated, and that whole thing of going back and forth of when they are able to get involved, and they seem much. You can get a sense of what they are really like outside of their troubles. Like if they had no problems in their life, you get a glimpse of what they might look like, and like how happy they would be in their life, if the circumstances didn't go the way they did for them, and which makes it even more heartbreaking when things keep coming back in really big ways. But one of the ways they really show this off really well is talking about like you've got stuff where like when her dad doesn't show up and she's like digging her fingernail into herself. Just these small but very big things at the same time that really tell you everything, while only showing you one layer of it. You can see all the other layers that are underneath it because they make that big of a splash when they're there. But then there's stuff like stuff that's not even really mentioned out loud that you just kind of you observe in one scene and then you observe in a later scene and it has a different meaning, and it's so big in a way that words could never really pull off. Just saying things could never really pull off, and saying what's going on here exactly. And what I'm talking about here mainly is the drawing thing. How Brie Larson's character Grace and Jaden have this in common, where it's like this is the moment where they kind of, because obviously Jaden is very away from everything else, and very puts up these barriers, and obviously is very sort of rebellious against everything, including the whole putting dick pictures on the wall thing, and doing the medical ones. But the thing here is, it's when Grace walks in and sees her drawing, and she's like, can I join you? And then this is like the moment where it's like, okay, they have some kind of connection. They both love to draw. And then the fact that later on, much later, Jaden uses her drawing to, in a way that Grace and not many others can see, uses her drawing to tell her story and like what's happening with her that nobody else can really see. And the fact that Grace is coming from the same place, is coming from the same background, and the fact that it was the thing that brought them together in like a nice way and almost a happy way, is now, that connection is now being used for, that's the other connection that they have. So that's, as far as doing things non-verbally and revealing things non-verbally, and connecting characters non-verbally, that's like when we when we realize what's happening and where that connection is. It's like I said, it's so big that there was no dialogue that was ever going to do that justice. And when the way this was pulled off is so, I struggle to say beautifully because it's obviously such an ugly subject and an ugly thing to happen to people. But like I said, it's that realism that brings the movie to life. That and it's yeah. So, like I said, as you can see, I'm also failing with words, much like a script would have if it had even tried. So we can just have that at that. But and there's and also the fingernail thing kind of comes into play also when it's when she gets the call that her dad's gonna be released, which is something that they set up early on, that her dad was imprisoned, and it's like once things are revealed, it's like you can't believe you didn't necessarily put the pieces together entirely, because it all just makes so much sense. And then that reveal of when she like brushes her hand against her head and you can see the blood streak from where she was doing something similar to herself, that Jaden was. Um, and it's like those connections are what it's, or what, yeah, the whole full circle thing. How we've talked before about how the thing about how like predatory behavior can be a full circle, where if you prey on somebody, then it's that person themselves may grow up to do the same thing. And then there's the case where you can break that circle, and Grace became somebody that helped people that were in her similar situation, and how that can also be some sort of circle. And it's, yeah, it's really heavy shit is what I'm trying to say, as if it needs to be said. Um, but then, and just really, I think something as far as talking about the realism of it is how lived in everything feels. How like there's some cases where like when you have characters that are like the main focus, it'll just be those. Like you get the idea that these are the, because these actors have the big scene, these are the only actors that are on set that day. But this is one of those movies where it's like you can have characters like Jaden or Marcus or Sammy or Luis or whoever, all kind of have their focuses at one point or another. Jaden and Marcus obviously more so, but Sammy and to a lesser extent Luis have those moments as well. And so you get these moments when something's happening with another character, like maybe Rami Malek's having a scene, or the other girl that works there, whose name I forget, is also working there, and they have all these interactions, and just in the background, like just like practically doing extra work, you will see Marcus walk by or Luis walk by, and just in the background, and that makes like so much of a difference as far as establishing the place as like this lived-in place where everybody, all of these characters are under the same roof, and are always around each other at all times, and that's how these relationships and this bonding works when we see it, and like stuff like the birthday scene and stuff like that. And it really makes that connection all the characters have. Something that you get, like I said, that's even like just a small detail. You can do something that small, like just have a character walk by in the background, and it brings so much more as far as there being just a full connection amongst all the other characters, and that's and more so on the no dialogue thing. There's also, like I was talking about, Rami Malek having scenes of his own as well, despite not having the, you know, the more dramatic underlying dramatic nature of like Grace's scenes or something, or the Grace and Mason scenes together. So there's the whole sequence where Sammy has his dolls taken away, and then there's just this whole segment that's always really fascinated me, and I think just the way that it's shown to us is how, with like no dialogue whatsoever for either scene, we're just watching Rami Malek just vacuuming, and then he's, doing the couch cushions, and then under the couch cushions he finds one of the dolls, or a doll, and then he takes it to Sammy and kind of gives Sammy this, just like that one thing that he needs to hold on. Where he's just laying in his room and everything just looks so empty. And then Rami Malek just comes in with this tiny doll and just gives him something. And then that's the whole thing. There's like nothing is said by anybody. There's no dialogue whatsoever. We just kind of observe this whole thing happen from the first step to the last of him cleaning and ultimately finding it and then giving it to him. It's just this small sequence that just, like I said, I feel like it really shows off, especially just what you can do with no dialogue and how sometimes much more powerful it can be. Um, so I really love that stuff. And then talking about how prominent the relationship is between Grace and Mason, and how her background is kind of coming into this, and it's making her hesitant to go into certain directions, particularly when she finds out that she's pregnant, and then when he asks her to marry him and all this stuff. And the thing about that is, not only does that also feel like there's so much rich character work going on here, but I also kind of like how they play with the idea of you can never quite tell if by the time we get to the end of this if it's going to be a happy ending or not, and if maybe some people get happy endings and some won't. You're kind of constantly wondering about this, especially, and the fact that you care so much about the characters by this point plays a huge part in this. But like when it gets to the point when they're at that event with his foster parents, I believe they are, and he asks her to marry him, and we know that she's pregnant, and it's like you get this sense that like you get really happy for the characters, but then there's another part of your brain that's like, is everything too happy too soon? And so you're always wondering, and especially when you see the kids and what they go through, you're always wondering when that next like shoe is gonna drop and something bad's gonna happen again. There's gonna be a sort of like relapse in regards to getting to a certain comfortable place and then going back. Um, and yeah, we do reach a point where we're kind of not entirely sure if there's gonna be a happy ending or not for really much of anybody. Especially as Jaden gets further into her story also, and her dad does start to come back into the picture just as we're learning about that relationship and how Grace connects to it. So, well, and obviously when it goes, it can. I could see where this movie could have maybe gone off the rails, because when it gets into Grace getting to that really dark place, and she's basically planning to go. You could say rescue Jaden, but obviously she's also confronting her own demons. So it's like it's one of these is the main objective: to rescue Jaden or to beat her father to death. In a sense, getting some sort of, or what she thinks in this moment would be some sort of cathartic moment in regards to her own life and her own experiences. And there's a point there where you think it might very well go that it might just embrace that darkness and go for it, which would have probably been, especially with how understated and real the rest of the movie feels. If it had gone in some revenge movie direction, I could see that being the most, instead of people praising this movie the way they do, it probably would have been very popular to say it was good until. But I mean, of course, like as soon as she doesn't do it, you're like, of course this isn't that movie. Like, of course this movie's smarter than that and more real than that, and more emotionally based than something like that, like a movie like that would be. Um, but still, the fact that it still says something about our investment, that we do believe for a second that it might have gone down that road. And so we get to the point where we have something that is considered a problem at the end of Lost Angels. That I think back when it first came out, I heard some criticisms about Short Term 12's happy ending. But what I think makes Short Term 12's last scene work so well is not only just the full circle bit of Sammy running out and them having to chase him again as they're inducting a new person in, but really just that the full circle of him telling the story of the previous patient that eventually died, and how they already establish the bleakness of that and the fact that that does happen, and sometimes that is the ending for some of these kids. Um, but that they establish that, I feel like it kind of earns Marcus's happy ending. Um, and I think another thing that makes that really work as well is that, like I said, when we start off, we're seeing it from Rami Malek's perspective. He's talking about a kid that we've never met and we've never seen, and who is like already gone, like from this life by the time we're hearing this story. So it's just something completely secondhand to us, and we have to imagine it. And now, at the end of the movie, when we're in Rami Malek's position where the story's now being told by somebody that we know very well, and it's like, in the fact that they're reminiscing, it feels like we're reminiscing also, and we're getting caught up on a character that we know, and it has a completely different feeling, that you're on the other side of this now from when you're, first coming into it, to when you have that connection that's, like I said, is coursing through everybody all at once when you see them in the groups, and you see them just wandering around in the background when they're not crucial to the scene, but they're still there. Um, I think that's what makes the ending so great, and the fact that, like I said, it's sort of like a payoff where, like, some of the kids have tragic stories, like we hear at the very beginning, and some of them have happy endings, like Marcus. So that's, I feel like that ending's perfect, honestly. And like I said, just the final full circle moment of Sammy running out and it starting all over again. It's the whole thing is so beautifully put together. And it's like, I didn't have the emotional connection to it that everybody else did the first time I saw it. But now that it's like 8 years old, it has had plenty of time to sit in, and it has done just that. It's one of those things where I was kind of like, I kind of just go back to it periodically, maybe every couple of years or so, and it just gets better, and more effective. And it's like, even when you can see where it's coming, like even when, you know, we're talking about like Jaden and her story, and about how she's always really upset and depressed and disappointed when her dad doesn't show up, or when it feels like her dad's abandoned her. It feels like it's setting up something else, like just a neglect. But when it's revealed what it is, it's like, it's even though if you've seen it multiple times, you know where it's going. It like it's or even if you're seeing it for the first time and you can anticipate it might be that. Um, Either way, it still hurts really bad when it comes around and when it's revealed what is going on. And that's a feeling that the movie pulls off repeatedly with multiple characters throughout, um, up to and including the ones that, like Grace, could be just as troubled in the past, and it's all coming back around, especially with her dad being released. Um, and how sometimes just nobody's okay, even the ones that are making sure that we're okay. And it's, like I said, it's just an ongoing thing. So yeah, there's, I don't know that I can say a negative thing about Short Term 12. Nothing comes to mind. So going over to Lost Angels, which may have a bit more of a dated factor to it, to say the least. It did come out in 1989, and has certain 1989 filming styles, I guess you could say. Filmmaking styles. But as far as where we start with, well, first off, we talked about Desmondino Cretton, who also did, like Just Mercy, and he reunited with Brie Larson for the Glass Castle, and then, of course, has now gone on to things as big as Shang-Chi, and God knows where else after that. Um, Lost Angels is by Hugh Hudson, the guy that did Chariots of Fire. So I'm curious what the expectations were for this when this came out, being a story that's clearly emotionally driven, from the director that did a movie as successful as Chariots of Fire. Certainly a different movie, to say the least. But when we see where Tim Adrock's character is coming from, as I was talking about, he's obviously coming from these places, but he seems like he finds himself more in circumstances through like peer pressure than being like one of the bad kids in quotes, um, or not in quotes. Some kids are just bad, but here we do have this sort of over the top setup a little bit where he is involved. While obviously, kids are always falling in with bad crowds, which is another thing of just like growing up in general, and just a matter of whether you find yourselves out of those bad crowds in time or not. And unfortunately, Tim doesn't before he gets put in this facility because it's kind of a one-two punch. He does meet Amy Locane, who is Cheryl, who he has a crush on, and they drive a car. She drives a car into a swimming pool. He just happens to be in the passenger seat uh, while this was going on, and that's kind of the straw that gets him put in there. But even before that, the reason he even knows her to begin with is because she is involved with I guess you could say, the leader of this sort of gang that they have, who is a very miscast William O'Leary, who was in movies like Hot Shots. Um, and it's this weird sort of West Side Story without the music kind of thing going on. Very, very 80s, but still that very familiar feeling of getting mixed up in the wrong crowds, and just following people on these paths that are going nowhere or worse, um, potentially dangerous paths. And but on top of that, talking about where else he's coming from is probably even more important. Where he's coming from family wise, because we talked about how he's very resentful of his mother and stepfather and how they may not be handling this in the most effective of ways, and they may only be alienating him more and more. His dad is also in the picture, who is Graham Begel, who you've probably seen in everything. And when he comes in, there's this whole thing when obviously they're talking about, like he picked up a gun on the scene, and he's, been caught with pills, I think, and the whole thing might feel like an after school special. Like that's the kind of thing that Los Angeles may have going against it, is the whole after school special feel. It has that a lot, but I still also probably chalk that up to just kind of the '80s factor in general. Um, and you could portray it more clearly in probably a different time and say when Short Term 12 did. But here still we open up a lot of the doors of the trouble place he's coming from. This involves his dad just slapping him in public in front of the cops, and just, I mean, he talked about them being assholes, his mom and his stepdad, as more of like a way of life, and his dad kind of comes off like a different kind of, like a more recognizable kind of asshole. And then you can see where he's coming from and where all this resentment comes from and why he may end up going down the wrong paths. There's even a scene in this that might seem over the top and movie-like, but I can only imagine has to be realistic. And that is when all this is going on and he's like in the courtroom and the judge is just so exasperated with like the family drama and just what's going on here in general, and like just trying to maintain control in some way. I could very much see that being a real thing, of like them just having a judge at the end of his rope, having to put up with the drama of this whole situation. But once he is in this facility, he ends up strapped to the bed, and then we meet our sort of saving grace character that's going to come in and maybe be the help that he's never gotten before from an adult, and that is Donald Sutherland. And you kind of get that sense, and like at first he almost has like this sort of almost warden vibe to him. The first look we get at him, when Tim is tied up in this room or strapped down in this room that's just got the white walls and like the one window in the door, and it's through that one window in the door the first time we see Donald Sutherland, and it looks like he has a threatening presence to him. Probably the many threatening characters that Donald Sutherland has played has something to do with that as well. But then as soon as he comes in and he starts talking to him in a way that, like I said, you feel like he's maybe never been talked to before by an adult. And then you suddenly realize, like, maybe this could be like a comfort person of sorts.
Um, and so when he comes in and he says, like, he's obviously going to be rebellious, like, it's another adult, it's another asshole, of course. And then Sutherland, he says, what are you looking at? And Sutherland says, I don't know yet. And you could take that as being dismissive, as just a snarky answer in return. But the way he says, I don't know yet, you can, like, see the door opening up of, like, maybe this is somebody that's going to give him a chance. Like this, like something that we clearly have not seen him have yet, coming from his family. So then it gets to the point where in this same scene, Sutherland eventually says, I've heard about everything you've done, and honestly, I don't blame you. And it's like, that's another thing where I don't blame you. This may very well be the first time he's hearing that. And then that just immediately sets up this whole thing, and this is all done while he's undoing the restraints also. So it's almost like this sort of symbolic thing, while he's saying all this as well, and just kind of introducing himself in general. Um, and then, like I was saying, we do get, while we do get it much, like when I was talking about getting it from the teen's perspective, that is much more so from strictly Tim's perspective. But we still get that in a very wide sense. Like, we really get where he's coming from and why he's so resentful. And we can probably take what we get from Tim and easily kind of put it on the other characters. So we may not be as openly. Like, the characters in Short Term 12 may be much more individuals, than, say, they are in Lost Angels. Like, Lost Angels, you kind of just go by, like, there's the girl that, rubs shit on herself, and there's the guy, David Herman is in this, the guy that played Michael Bolton in Office Space. So it's like he's there. And John C. McGinley is in this as well, so there's that connection. But but even so, like I said, the perspective that we get from Tim feels like it says a lot about some of the other characters we may not, meet as intimately or get as much in their heads, as we do him. But what it also comes down to is, like I was talking about, the infighting in regards to the people that run the place, and then we really get a look at where Donald Sutherland's character is coming from, and we see him from outside the respective. Like, it's sort of like when you had a teacher in school, and then when you see them later when they're not your teacher, and it feels like a different dynamic. You sort of get that sense where we see Sutherland and the way he interacts with the kids, and then these separate scenes where he's interacting with his coworkers, which is not going well, particularly with John C. McGinley, who's one of the more just sort of, we're just doing it for the money, and, fuck the kids, who cares? As long as we get what we need. Um, and and there's that whole thing when they kind of bring in gradually things about his character, and of course Tim is listening in on this. So we get moments when Sutherland's really, in defense of this, and he's talking about the whole thing about how we change up how long we keep them and how much we treat them by how much money we're getting. And then he, like, kicks a table across the room. And of course McGinley is very just, oh great, he's being all dramatic, who cares? And then he says something just in passing, like, why don't you have another drink or something like that. And it's like just little comments like that, just throwaway comments, suddenly give us a whole bombshell of what Sutherland had going on at one point in this battle with alcoholism, and which Tim is just gonna just sort of naturally bring up in conversation later. And, like, so the way it kind of just picks up these little things that it's gonna drop later, come in nicely. But like I said, we are dealing with a movie that was made in a different time, and it is it's very interestingly shot. It has a lot of interesting ideas and an interesting eye, even if it's very much of the late '80s. But, like, some of these scenes that are shot, like when Tim tries to escape at one point, and we get, like, these really wide shots that are, like, really nice contrast to the confines of the walls of the facility, stuff like that. Even some of the gang scenes at the beginning are interestingly shot, even though, like I said, it's almost like it's like those, like, Boulevard Nights or something like that, or Streets of Fire or something. But and it does get, quite into the melodramatic, where
where all the drama in Short Term 12 feels like it's coming from a very real place. And like I said, like we're observing something that's not even fiction. Um, there's definitely some real feelings in Lost Angels, but but the thing also about it reaching the point of melodrama is that there is this way you can kind of separate it where it's like when something really dramatic happens or one of the kids does something that's like really over the top dramatic, more dramatic than it needs to be, it's like that's also number one, just teenagers in general, but especially troubled teens. So it's almost like it makes sense when it's going into that '80s melodrama. So it's and it's but I think the reason that it might not ring as true as something like Short Term 12 is, like I said, just the very dated execution of it. Even if you can still come to terms with the fact that troubled teens are dramatic, that's just the way it's going to be. It's like whether it be like a music cue or the way it's shot or something might be make it a bit much and make it almost a bit soap opera-y in a way that could have been more natural. But yeah, and from a I don't know. I was gonna say from a director as downplayed as the guy that would have made Chariots of Fire, but obviously Chariots of Fire also is quite dramatic and very theatrical. But appropriately for that movie, I don't know that that would translate as much to something like this. That should probably be um, much more grounded than like the whole '80s vibe was at the time. Like almost like in a way that hadn't been discovered by directors that were working prominently in the '80s. Might have been, but um, like I said, we do have some very strong performances here. I know that it might seem like a big stretch, and it might seem like, is it just because of the subject matter? I don't know, but regardless of what it was, there were some reviews at the time where Ad Rock was compared to James Dean. And like, had he gone more down the acting path, what else he might have done was something that came up. And of course, Sutherland is really great here and kind of really brings the heart to it, and brings a lot of the emotion forward. There is one performance that sticks out in a really bad way, and that would be um, Amy Locane. And as far as the way that she plays Cheryl, um, I do believe it might have been her first movie. Like, she maybe had done like TV stuff up to this point, but as far as it being her first movie, I don't know how much of a difference that makes. But it's like basically every single one of her scenes feels like a bad audition. And it brings a lot down, especially with the connection he's supposed to have to her. Like, by the time it gets to the end and they just kind of break off from each other, it's like you wish that had happened much sooner. Because we also get stuff like the sex scene, and it's like pretty much anything here by her, sadly, is quite poorly acted, even for the late '80s standard of young actors. In something that's like trying to be as grounded and real as this is, even if it's not quite reaching that, it's a little too over the top to reach that grounded nature. It's a bit much, and really sticks out in a bad way. And then, and I guess you could also say that about when he's one of the few times when he's out towards the end and his brother's trying to get him back into that life of crime, and you got like Kevin Corrigan is in these scenes, so some kind of crime is probably going to take place. And those feel a bit out of place also. Like, I get why they're here, but I feel like you probably could have established something much more naturally dramatic. If a lot of the building up to some sort of climax and some sort of big character turn or some sort of cathartic place could be met for Tim, just through like history and just through scenes with Donald Sutherland. He has many scenes with Donald Sutherland that kind of get us from point A to point B as far as his character having an arc. And obviously Sutherland has his own thing going on. He even pretty much explicitly says that when he says, like, what about your alcoholism? he basically says, like, it was my job to get you to this point. It's also my job to get myself to whatever point I need to get to. Because I'm still the adult in this scenario. Now, speaking of that last scene when Sutherland drops him off, and how we've gotten from this point, and Tim has a bit of an arc that kind of took this detour with his brother. I was talking about how Short Term 12 really earned its happy ending and how it got to that point from the very first scene and used that and then came back around. The happy ending in Lost Angels seems like it comes from out of nowhere. Tim makes a very big choice to basically open up and let this life happen, and his parents and all that stuff, and it feels like it's. I'm still not quite sure how he got to that point, or if it's like it feels like you hear about tacked on endings a lot. I mean, if you wanna if you wanna talk about endings that feel like, well, that was very sudden, almost like it doesn't feel like it was the intended ending. And I'm not against happy endings. Like, I'm not against like ending with optimism. Like, if anything, that could be just as powerful as ending pessimistically and going into realism based on that. But there's something about this ending just feels so off. I don't know, and it really, really conflicts with what the rest of the movie is. And the fact that we've seen so much of it from Tim's perspective and heard his words from inside his head, it's a weird place to end up and not completely satisfying. So, yeah. So, I do think Lost Angels is worth checking out because it's got, a couple great performances, especially if you want to see how good of an actor Hadrock actually is. And how he probably could have had a really promising acting career, but the music thing worked out pretty well too. So, to say the least. But as far as what Short Term 12 has going on, as far as just hitting those emotional beats, but not really like trying to, like I was talking about with like how it reaches all its dramatic beats like really gradually and they feel real. The whole thing with his brother and stuff like that does feel like a script. Rather than just, observing real teens with real troubles. Even though, like I said, it's not entirely out of the realm, watching him succumb to, like, peer pressure and, under his brother and being a part of this group and all this stuff. Having to do all this stuff to please them is all stuff that is real. Like I said, it's really just the execution of it that does it in a fashion that's kind of going against what its other accomplishments are. In this very contrasting way that doesn't quite pan out entirely, but there's definitely plenty in here to see. But as far as what Short Term 12 does, like I said, I don't know that Short Term 12 misses a beat or hits like a wrong note or a false note. So that's pretty much where we go with these, I think. So the next one, I think we're going to go into that 70s political thriller territory, and well, we're going to hit up something before that, I think, and then we'll go from there. We've got a whole lineup of stuff like this, and like I said, we're going to explore some series and trilogies and stuff like that as well, until we get to the more horror-themed stuff in October, plus all the new releases that are going to be weekly, so a whole bunch of shit through September and October. So until the next thing, I think that's it.